Okay, so now let's take a look at the VFB and the advantages of using it over the Maya render view. Start with the scene file birdvfb.ma, which gives us the bird scene we started with, but with lights and render settings all ready to go. Set your view to camera 1 and click to render. The VFB pops open and begins rendering the scene. Now, because we're set to progressive sampling mode by default, the render will continue to improve the image until it reaches the max render time, which is currently set to 1 minute. Now, the longer the render runs, the cleaner the result. The render can also stop when it hits the noise threshold, which is defined here. The lower this number, the longer the render. Of course, whichever of these two limits is reached first will halt the render. With progressive, you get to see your overall image faster, so you can make decisions on your overall lighting without having to wait for a full render. Now, if you just want to make changes to part of the image, you can use region render to select an area in the image like this, and then when you click render again, the system renders only that part of the image. Now, I'll start another render, but just seconds into it, I'll click the stop icon to halt, and I can see how my lighting looks. Now, back in Maya, I'm going to set my perspective view to look about like this. In the VFB, right-click on the Render Teapot to select the Persp view to render that. Use the white circle to toggle the alphas display, and the RGB icons here to isolate the color channels for a closer inspection of your work. You can save images through the floppy disk icon, as well as load an image with the folder icon next to it. This icon will copy the image to your clipboard for pasting elsewhere, and this icon clears the image from the VFB altogether. Click the double arrows here for some more controls. This icon will add a stamp to your render, which by default lists the V-Ray version as well as the render time for that image, which is super helpful in comparing test renders. Click the double arrow again to hide those controls. Now, as far as comparing renders, click the H button here. This opens the render history window, which you need to turn on. The first time you enable history, it takes you directly to the settings. Here you specify a folder to save the images and also a maximum disk space that you'll want to allot to your history cache. As you can see, I have allotted quite a lot of space on my cache drive with my history going way back. You can dock the history to the VFB like so. This icon saves to the history, which is a VRIMG file on your hard disk, which also stores any render elements for that image. Now, you should have a render of your perspective view in the VFB right now, so click the floppy disk icon in the history to save it. Back in the scene, select the dome light and set the intensity to 0.25. And then back in the VFB, go ahead and render the scene to take a look at how the lighting has changed. To compare it to the previous render, simply double-click the previous image in the history, and it will save the current render to the history, then display the previous render you just double-clicked. Double-click any history image to compare your renders. You can also press the number key that corresponds to the history image you want to display. Now go to your current render, number 1, and press the A icon. Go to your previous render, which is brighter, and press the B icon. You can slide between the two images for a closer comparison. This is a great way to see changes to your scene, subtle as they may be. Click the AB icon to disable the comparison. Select the dome light and set it back to intensity of 1. Now let's talk about render elements. These are image component passes that can be used to composite the image back together for a more robust control in compositing. We'll cover these in detail later in the course, but for now, open Render Settings and in the GI tab, turn on GI. Back to the Render Elements tab, select Diffuse, GI, Lighting, and Normals to see how the VFB handles render elements. Click Add to add them to your render. Now in the VFB, what I'll do is make sure to save this image as the number 1 in my history, and then I'll click Render. And nothing really changes. However, click the Render Element drop-down to see a list of the elements that you just rendered. Select each one to display the element in the VFB. With one of them being displayed, click the Save icon to save that specific render element to disk. You can click and hold the Save icon to drop these two other options down. With this one, you can save all the elements to separate image files, or with this bottom icon, you can save all the render elements to a single multi-channel EXR file. Make sure to turn off the stamp at the bottom to avoid seeing the stamp in your output, unless you'd like that information to be burned in. Now, as a matter of fact, you can add stamp data as you'd like. Click the % symbol here and choose the information that you'd like to have in your stamp, and then copy to stamp. You can manually enter your own characters just like this by typing them in to make your own labels. The icons down here have to do with toggling color corrections, which we'll take a look at in future clips. For now, click the Show Color Corrections icon here to show the controls on the right. Now, you can go ahead and adjust things like exposure and white balance to tweak your image directly in the VFB. And let's take a look at hue saturation. Now, there's not a lot of color going on in here, so let's fix that. In the Hypershade, I'll change the bird's body shader, which is Matte Bird 000, to a bright blue. I'll select a feather back here and change that material, Matte Bird 020, to red. I'll find a better angle and set off another render to the VFB. Now you can go into the color controls and really get a feel for how well the VFB can manipulate the colors in the image. Now, right-clicking on the image gives you pixel information before and after any corrections that you've added. The corrections you can toggle with the icons down here as well as on the right. And lastly, use the mouse wheel to zoom in or out of your image, and click and drag the middle mouse button to move around in a zoomed view. Now, there are a few more tricks up the VFB sleeve, and we'll come across those throughout this course. But in this clip, we've taken a pretty thorough tour of the VFB and its functionality.